This video is sponsored by Snot Goblin Gaming and their future-proof terrain. More about them later in the video. Greetings everyone, my name is Rejnols, and today we're kinda doing a part 2 of my terrain video series. The first video was simply talking about the rules of terrain in 10th edition. This second video is a bit more talking about terrain layouts. So it's kind of a part 2, kind of not a part 2. In any case, terrain layouts. What are they? Who makes them? And why should you use them? First and foremost, terrain layouts are meant for more competitive games, so if all you do is play friendly games, where set up your own objectives and decide your own rules and all that kind of stuff, there is no need to use the terrain layouts. They are meant for playing the game in a more competitive manner. Various organizers and organizations makes these different terrain layouts. In general, you have the 4 big ones, and then there's also a 5th one. So first and foremost, there is Games Workshop. They've actually stepped up from not really having anything to do with the tournament scene or competitive scene of Warhammer at all, to being quite a bit more invested into it. In 9th edition, they came out with some layouts, and in 10th edition, they came out with 4 different layouts. I believe you can find all of them in the Leviathan match play document. The only bad thing I have to say about GW's layouts, just like straight away, is that they don't say which layout you should use for what mission. And normally when you create a layout, you create it with the idea of a specific deployment zone, because it's much easier to balance how terrain is set up if you know how the players are going to set up in that deployment zone. But in GW's case, they don't seem to tell you which layout to use for what deployment zone, so that could create some balancing issues. But in any case, GW has their own layouts, which is a big step up from what they've used to be doing, which is nothing. I personally have not played a lot on GW terrain. I hear it is fine. It still suffers for one of those fairly open layouts, some of them anyway, where you can kind of see from one end of the map to the other. But in general, I'd say they're fairly decent. The next one is kind of twofold. There's the ITC and the UKTC, which is the same thing, but not quite the same thing, and I've never quite understood what the difference is. In any case, those 2 organizations, which is actually one but have different layouts, also create terrain layouts, which you can find on their respective websites, as well as for various events where they use ITC and UKTC rules and all of that kind of stuff. I haven't read too much into it, but Games Workshop seems to have either taken over or made a partnership with ITC to kind of be their main outlet for competitive Warhammer. What this means for the layouts that the ITC and UKTC use right now, I don't know. Maybe they all switch to GW layouts. Maybe they work with GW to create some new layouts that'll be like the standard competitive pack. Or maybe everything continues as it is now. I don't quite know yet. And I also haven't looked too much into it. So if someone out there who plays regularly in either ITC events or UKTC events could give a bit more clarification as to what's happening there in the comments below, that would be very cool. Then we have the one that I'm used to, the WTC. The WTC is used all over the world, but it's mostly popular in Europe. Whereas the UKTC is mostly popular in the UK, and the ITC is mostly used in America. Then you have GW, which is then again also used all over the place. So, WTC layouts are well known for having a lot of terrain compared to the other options. Or rather, it's very dense. You can see here on the picture I have here, that's a GW layout, that the number of ruins is quite high, but they're very tightly packed together on these same surfaces. On a WTC layout, there would be a lot more terrain spread out across the map, meaning a lot of line of sights are cut off at weird angles. And then finally, we have my personal least favorite option, player plays terrain. Player plays terrain is a thing that will probably exist for as long as Warhammer does. Because player plays terrain does something that the other layouts doesn't do. They cater to absolutely everyone. If you're a competitive player, you can gain an advantage by knowing how to place the ruins. If you're a new player, you just set up the ruin where you think it looks fun or looks cool. If you're a narrative player, once again, you just set up the terrain to look cool. And it also lets you use whatever kind of terrain you want because, well, it's player plays, right? It doesn't have to conform into any format. So you just place whatever you feel looks good and then you say, all right, let's play. The reason why I don't like player plays personally is some of those things that I just talked about that makes it cater to a lot of people. First and foremost, the competitive part. If you fuck up, you can straight up just lose the game. Now that might sound rough to you, but if I misplace a terrain piece where I think I can get into cover, and then I cannot get into cover, and my opponent just has all of the options to shoot me off the board turn 1 or turn 2, then I basically lost the game because I failed to understand where to place that piece of terrain. Some people then argue that it's an added skill, and I guess that's true. It is an added skill knowing where to put that piece of terrain to benefit you the most or to inconvenience your opponent the most. But I just think it creates unnecessary skill gaps in a game that is already filled with rules interactions that most people don't know about. Second of all, player placed could be good, but it just seems like every time I see player placed terrain on a live stream at a competitive event, it's like, here is 5 ruins at completely different sizes, and some of them with windows, some of them without windows. This one is a magic box, this one isn't. It's just so inconsistent. I think maybe I could tolerate player placed terrain if there were an equal amount of pieces of terrain. So let's say 8 pieces, that means you get to place 4 and your opponent gets to place 4, and they were of equal sizes. That means that, let's say you have 2 L ruins, right? You get 1 L ruin and your opponent gets 1 L ruin. Then you both get, a square whatever forest or something. But that's just doesn't seem to be the case with player placed terrain ever. It's always randomly sized terrain pieces, sometimes an uneven amount of terrain pieces, and I don't like it. That's me personally. Then finally, you might have local layouts. Local layouts are usually made to accommodate that local area's meta. This happens mostly if your local gaming club does not have terrain enough to put up, 6 tables of WTC layout or ITC layouts. When that happens, they try and look at other layouts and say, okay, what if we move this piece of terrain up there and remove this? That means we can use 6 pieces of terrain instead of 8, and we can accommodate all those tables. But in general, if you're playing in competitive, or at least slightly competitive interested club or local area, then you will have enough terrain for this and you don't need to worry about it. But maybe they make their own layouts anyway because someone thinks it's fun. That being said, if you're heading into any tournaments, you can almost always be sure it's either going to be GW, ITC, UKTC, WTC, or player placed, all depending on where you live in the world. Now we talk a lot about terrain layouts, but one thing is for certain, to use a terrain layout, you need terrain. And where can you get this terrain? Well, you could get it from GW if you're willing to spend about $1 million. That is of course a joke, but GW does not produce terrain that is readily available at all times. When they do produce terrain, it's usually not enough for a full table, and it's pretty expensive because it's plastic, it's high quality, it looks amazing. But if you need, 20 boxes of it to make one table, then that's probably as expensive as buying a full army or even more. That is where today's sponsor, Snot Goblin Gaming, comes in. Snot Goblin Gaming is creating terrain you can easily build the way that you want to. Whether that be for GW layouts, ITC layouts, or just for narrative games, Snot Goblin Gaming terrain have a plethora of options, and there's sure to be a build option that'll work for you. If you're interested in learning more about Snot Goblin Gaming terrain, be sure to check out the links in the description below. So we talked a little about the ups and downs of the various terrain layouts, why I like them or why I dislike them personally, and ultimately the question that a lot of people will ask is, which one is the best, which one should I be using? And here I just have to say that there will never be a universal agreement on what terrain layouts to use. And I've tried opening this, Pandora's box even so many times, and I've had so many different comments, and some people even get really freaking angry when you talk about it. And ultimately, what I have come to realize is that whatever terrain that you either started playing on, learned to play on, or that your local area mostly plays on, will probably be your favorite. If you play a lot of tournaments in America, ITC or player placed is probably the one that you like the most. And if you looked at a WTC layout, you would call us crazy because there's no way a shooting army can work on those terrain layouts. Conversely, for me, I started playing Warhammer on WTC layouts. I learned the game on WTC layouts. I learned to play melee armies. I learned to play shooting armies. I learned to play against melee armies. I learned to play against shooting armies on those terrain layouts. I know both can work because I've won as both, I've lost as both, and I think the terrain is great. Because when I look at other terrain, I just see a clear advantage for shooting armies. But if you only play on, GW layouts, you don't see the advantage. You see that as the standard. And that is probably why we can never ever come to an agreement on which layout is the best and which one you should be playing on. Because the standard for people is different. And so there are none of them that is the best. Which also means that none of them are unplayable. I think all of the terrain layouts have competitive play. But you just need to learn to play on it. And once again, if that means that you usually play on ITC and then you go to WTC and you just feel like you cannot get an angle of shooting, well, that's just not true because there's plenty of shooting armies playing on WTC. Conversely, if I go play on, a player plays terrain or ITC terrain with my melee army, I go, how the heck do I get anywhere without being shot? But those of you who already play on that terrain know that it is possible to move around that terrain without getting shot. So in conclusion, none of them is the best, and it is all 100% up to you. Finally, I will say that, well, there is probably going to be a bias for the army you play. If you are playing a really shooting heavy army, obviously you're going to like the terrain that has more lines of sight. And if you're playing a melee heavy army, you're probably going to like the terrain where you can jump from ruin to ruin and plan your charges. In the end though, as I said, all of them are completely playable terrains and you should just play on, whatever your local group plays on. If you find yourself struggling on the terrain layout that your group uses, try and ask them what it is and you might actually find out that it's not a terrain layout, it's just randomly laid out terrain, and then next time you play, suggest that you play on, GW layouts. Because as I said, these terrain layouts are made to cater towards the competitive scene, but they do also really help balance out a potential casual game if you feel like you're getting shot too much, or that you just don't know how to place the terrain, that sort of thing. That just removes that part of the game setup for you and just tells you, do it like this and then go play. Once again, if you're interested in Snot Goblin Gaming terrain, check out the links in the description below. Alright, to end off the video, new players are going to ask me, what terrain should I be playing on? How do I learn to play the game the best? And the answer is a really boring one because there is none. Just play whatever your local area does. If they do player plays terrain, you might as well start learning it now, because if you start playing more Warhammer or go to tournaments, then that's probably going to be the norm, right? They're going to be using player plays terrain. If they use ITC, just start playing on ITC terrain. It doesn't really matter. If you and a friend are playing, just the two of you and you don't really have a local area to go to, I recommend GW layouts. The reason why I recommend GW layouts is because they don't have a specific size for ruins. They don't say, oh, you need to use these and these and these ruins. Instead, they say, here is the ruin footprint, put whatever ruin you have on it, and go from there. And I think that's a fair take. Obviously, as I suggested at the start of the video, if it's possible, make sure you have equal amounts of terrain that are the same size, or even if possible, completely identical, to not give one advantage over the other player. Because if you have one ruin that is roughly the same size but is full of windows, and then you have another piece of terrain that has no windows, well, obviously the one without windows have an advantage if you don't want to be shot, and the one with windows have an advantage if you want to be able to shoot out. The most important part of 10th edition terrain is not the ruins itself. It is actually the footprints on which the ruin stands. So on this image here, that's a WTC layout. The blue and red rectangles define the footprints of the ruins. And if you're wondering why that is the most important part of terrain, go watch my first video where I talk about the rules about terrain. And that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to Snot Goblin Gaming for sponsoring the video. And until I see you again, I hope you have a wonderful time.